My talk today is a little bit different to other ones I've given here before, which have been specifically either on counterfeits and reproductions. I've talked about those, and I guess that the work, what I'm presenting here, is closer to that. And the other work I've presented has been on the Mosquito and Ulwa, who are two peoples I've been doing field work with for the last 20 or so years. I've been interested in the question of money for a long time, and that interest comes out of my interest in objects and what anthropologists call the social life of things. How we ascribe meaning and value to objects, and one of the ways in which this is an area that some anthropologists have called, following Arjun Appadurai, the social life of things, that things have kind of social lives, and we can only understand meanings and values of things when we look at the ways in which they're circulated, distributed, produced, and so forth. I was particularly interested in things like counterfeits. I was interested in counterfeits records, which is a business I was once involved with, and also counterfeit money as well, because why is it that these objects, which apparently look the same, they sound the same, they feel the same, they are almost to all but the most educated eyes and ears, they are the same. Why, but nevertheless, do they have such differing values? So that's really one of the reasons why I got into kind of things, and particularly money. I teach at University of East London, and one of the modules I teach involves one term's worth of economic anthropology, and in that I've had a lot of my students has given me very good comments and feedback about those kind of things. So without further ado, I'll get on to the talk, which is gift exchange or barter, the origins and functions of money. And this isn't a lecture on history about the history of what we know about money. These are really speculations, I guess, based on a considered look at the ethnography of money, how money is used and treated, how it's circulated in a number of different cultures, or a number of different societies, or different social formations, as Marxists might say. What I want to really do, and this is perhaps more in tune with the series of seminars, is I'm really looking at myths about what money is, and two particular myths. There are two myths within anthropology, I think, about how money originates, and that one is through barter, that money was developed as a technology of exchange to facilitate barter. I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. And the other is that money, which is a newer, in some ways fresher, but in some ways also problematic idea, that money developed as from prestige valuables, how prestige valuables came to be used and circulated. So, first of all, I want to talk about something, a phenomenon which appeared in the 1980s in Romania, and this is through the work of an anthropologist called Catherine Verdere, who did some work on in Romania in the 1990s rather, and one of the things that Catherine Verdere in her work was particularly interested in was this how people imagined the transition from communism, from Ceausescu communism, to, if you like, the free market, and how that affected people's understandings of the economy, the way they used money, all of those kind of things. And she wrote a very interesting article, which is quite short. It's in Anthropology Today. It's very readable, and it's about this phenomenon called Caritas. And Caritas was a pyramid investment scheme which originated in the early 90s in Transylvania, and it was one of these schemes that if you invested, it promised to pay you back eightfold in 3 months. And basically it didn't have any kind of foundation at all in, it didn't produce anything or anything like that. And because national inflation at the time in Romania was so high, that this was kind of quite attractive. People in Romania didn't really have much experience of money in the free market, as it were, and so a lot of people were kind of quite convinced that this was a good thing. So investors just put money in. A lot of investors actually, at the beginning, some investors did very, very well, because those who got in on it first, that the people who came after them paid for the money they got, and those who were wise enough pulled out quite quickly. Those that came in later, though, found that the scheme suddenly, as pyramid schemes do, collapsed, and all of that money was, they lost a lot of money. So this was really, for Romanians, it was a painful introduction to what money had become. Money essentially was now a new kind of animal. Before it, the uses of money, the way the money was valued, was controlled by the state. After that money became wild or savage, as some anthropologists have said. It became quite different kind of animal, and people didn't really know what to make of it. People who made money out of caritas in the beginning, that they were kind of made this careful distinction between what they thought was their own money and this money that they'd made, which somehow was contaminated and polluting and dangerous. And this money that they made out of it, there was somehow thought of being haunted, because money isn't naturally fecund. Money is, and this particular kind of money is barren, they thought, and things that they bought with it were haunted, so that they with caritas money, that things, they'd buy sofas and then they'd find them at night flying around the house and things like that. And so this caritas money was very, very dangerous. So anyway, the point is that people were suddenly faced with this with this reality that money was something altogether different to what it had been. Okay, so that's just a little story which perhaps we'll come back to. Now I want to get on to the matter in hand, and you've got two competing ideas about the origins of money. One is this idea that money originates as a means of facilitating barter. So I've got a pig, you've got a cow, and okay, we exchange my pig for your cow, but sometimes you're not going to want my pig, so money steps in, is invented as this technology of exchange, which is a sort of like a holding thing of value until I've got something that you want, and so on. So that's the popular theory of how money originated. The other theory, this is the other idea within anthropology, which is this newer idea, is that money originates from prestige valuables, things like, you say they're like the crown jewels or the Mona Lisa or rare records, or for those of you who've read more anthropology, things like cooler valuables, rare valuables that are distributed, that as those things become used as means of payment, that those things have value, and that money becomes, as those charisma of those objects in some sense becomes more routinized, it becomes, they become in some sense less special, but they still have this particular value, and money develops in this way out of prestige valuables, not out of barter. So money develops from gift exchange rather than barter, and gift exchange and barter are two different things, as I'm hoping to convince you later on. Next thing, gifts and barter, well, what is the difference between barter and gifts? Well, barter is that it doesn't presuppose any kind of social relation between the transactors. So, in fact, barter maintains boundaries between the transactors, that if you want my pig and I want your cow, for example, with this and we exchange, the relationship isn't about sociality in any sense. There's no relationship that barter can take place across between different moral universes, in a sense. We don't have to belong to the same moral universe. It's purely a utilitarian kind of type of transaction. You want what I've got and I want you've got, and it's a very strictly balanced. The reciprocal relationship between transactors is balanced insofar as we're both calculating to see, as far as we're concerned, that we get what we want out of it, that we get a fair deal. Of course, it might not be viewed from the other transactor's point of view. So barter can take place between different value systems, and many anthropologists argue that barter really only takes place between different value systems, because within a particular value system, within a particular, if you like, social milieu, the way gifts are transacted primarily is by gift exchange. Gift exchange involves the reciprocal exchange of gifts. Things like in Papua New Guinea Highlands, you have mocha exchanges, which are exchanges of pigs, which are gifts exchange of pigs, which confer value on the people who give them. They acquire prestige through making gifts to others. And potlatch, which is a similar thing, which was from the northwest coast of North America, where you give potlatch coppers and many other kinds of gifts, and that confers you status as being the donor. And what gifts do is they contrive asymmetry, that the donor has some kind of, if you like, symbolic dominance over the recipient until the recipient comes back. So gift giving, on one hand, it has this rather benign aspect, which some anthropologists have called generalized reciprocity, whereby people give gifts as a means of establishing kind of sociality and helping others. But on the other hand, there's also what anthropologists have called negative reciprocity, where gift giving involves acts of hostility, that you give someone something to engineer indebtedness, as Raymond Firth famously put it. You engineer indebtedness, and this is what gift giving is about. It's an act of hostility. Anthropologists who go into the field, they're often surprised when they go into the field and someone tells them, "Oh, I was angry with him, so I gave him a pig." And people think, well, how does that figure out? Well, what you're doing is you're engineering a social obligation on that person. So gift giving tends to work within a single value system, because people outside, they don't know, they're not interested in establishing relations with you or whatever. So you've got these two types of transactions. You've got barter on the one hand and gift on the other. Okay, so and in the two theories, one, money originates out of barter, and the other originates out of gifts. Okay, now we step to the side a little bit and look at money, and what anthropologists looking at money, not only national currencies, but looking at them too, but also other kinds of monies, shell monies, and all kinds of objects that have been used as currency at different times and places, that they've looked at what the functions of money are. So some have said that money has been identified as being a technology of exchange, that it facilitates exchanges in the way I've told you about the cow and the pig and so on. It's also a means of payment, so if you just want to simply buy something, to get something off someone, you want to give them something which is a measurably equivalent worth, you give them something like money. It's also a standard of value, so different objects of completely different kinds, and this is kind of quite a radically different idea for those in societies where this hasn't existed, where the value of things can be made comparable. Yeah, this is an idea that Simmel runs with in his famous book, The Philosophy of Money, which is very important. And money is also a store of wealth. It's usually represented by something that doesn't deteriorate. It's kind of quite lightweight. It's kind of you can just put it away and have lots of it kind of stashed away somewhere. So that's and money is, I would argue, quite an unusual idea. And what money does then is it can make property detachable from persons. So persons can have property, and property can be detached from you, can be alienated and passed on to someone else. And that works in different ways, in different social formation, different societies, and the functions identified in the previous slide vary according to those. So what I'm proposing to do is skip through some of the ethnography, both national currencies and also primitive, so-called primitive monies, like which have been used, shells and so on, and also prestige valuables, some of which quite clearly have the properties of money that I've already identified in the previous slide. Right, I want to look first at the mythic origins of money in barter. How does money originate in barter? Now, this idea that money originated out of barter is one which was Aristotle proposed. Marx suggests that money originates this way, or not just suggests, but states that it does. Also Adam Smith, that money originates through barter, through lubricating exchanges of the cow and the pig and so on. And Marx developed this notation. This is actually Marx's own notation for the emergence of money. It says, and each of these bullet points represents a different stage. So the first stage, you simply got goods, which are called C. And then you've got the exchange of goods through barter, the reciprocal exchange of goods, purely for their use values, not to establish inalienable reciprocal relations like gift-giving would. These are purely a utilitarian thing, barter. So C is exchange for C, goods for goods. Then you've got, when you've got the pig and you don't want the cow sort of situation, that you have to have this technology of exchange, which is introduced, which is M, which is money. And then so goods can be exchanged for money, which can then be exchanged for other goods. And then for Marx and Aristotle, this is where it all starts to go wrong, because money then becomes the end in itself rather than the goods. The money becomes the end in itself, and with money that you have, money is then used to buy goods, which then make more money. See the little apostrophe next to the second M, that represents more money in Marx's notation. And then finally, the worst evil of all is that you have money being sold for more money, which is usury and money lending. So this is the road to evil that money leads us down in Marx's and Aristotle's understanding of how this works. All right, this is Marx's own notation. So money then is essentially immoral, but for Aristotle that the household or whatever, there was this idea of the self-sufficient household. For Marx, there's this idea of the species being that human beings really are there to reproduce the conditions of their own existence, to hunt in the morning, to go fishing at night, or do all of those things when so they realise their own labour. They're not alienated from their labour, they're not alienated from the things they produce, they're not alienated from the conditions of their labour, they can work when and where they like and so forth. All of those things under capitalism and with the emergence of the factory system are lost. And what happens then is that money, that M, becomes to represent alienated labour and becomes to represent a surplus value, and that money in the form becomes this thing which is imagined to have its life of its own. And as human beings have to sell their labour to the owners of capital and become more thing-like, money becomes then super animate and can grow and is fecund and fertile and does all of these kind of strange, funny things. So money drives the wedge between persons and things. It's this corrosive social acid, but it's although people think otherwise, that the money is essentially barren, because what money really represents is labour, and money doesn't grow. What it does is it attracts more exploitation. Well, this view of money wasn't really shared by Simmel, who wrote a classic about just over 100 years ago called The Philosophy of Money. And that Simmel saw money more optimistically. He saw it also out of barter. But money was really an expansion of the circle of trust. It was an instrument of freedom, and it allowed different things to be translated between different value systems, so that things which were otherwise incommensurate valued could be worth. So if you say that that Mars bar is worth 7 and 6 and your bus ticket's also worth 7 and 6, then they're worth exactly the same, and you can say they have the same worth, whereas to someone in a situation without money, that's a sort of a ludicrous idea, because those things are incommensurable. This is an abstraction of a value for Simmel. Yeah. And money, the value, like Marx, one of the things that Simmel shares is that money is valued in terms of the totality of exchanges. So all the transactions that are going on, using, for example, the pound, really determine what the pound is worth. So everything from that IKEA chair you bought to that parking ticket to whatever it was, all of those things added up, all contribute to the value of what money is. And money, therefore, is, in this way of thinking it's a commodity because in the first place it's produced to facilitate the exchange of commodities, and it's completely opposite for a gift because money is all money notes, if you like £20 notes all look exactly the same apart from the little number. So they make very, very poor gifts. There's nothing personal about money, and therefore they don't circulate very comfortably as gifts, but they work supremely well as for all of those functions otherwise. So this is the kind of, if you like, the story of how money might have originated out of barter. I want to look now at an alternative idea that some anthropologists have put forward, notably Mary Douglas and Keith Hart has suggested this in some of his work, is that money does not originate in barter, but in gift exchange. But because in economies, Mary Douglas has said that in economies based on gift exchange, and most small-scale economies are based on that economies are organised around gift exchange, that obtaining credit is very, very easy. People want to give you things to establish some kind of symbolic dominance over you. The whole point of these small-scale economies is that you give, and therefore getting credit for things is very, very easy. People want to lend you things all of the time, and what they don't want to is to be told, here is a pig, by someone who's angry with them. So, gift economies, how do they actually work? Well, most famously, Malinowski looked at, really with, if you like, showed how gift exchange worked in a non-Western culture, in a way that was completely, at first blush, alien to Western sensibilities, when he looked at a phenomenon in an area called the Trobriand Islands, which was part of the Western Pacific. And this is the area which was called the Masim, which includes the eastern tip of New Guinea there, and also a lot of other islands. He did fieldwork on the Trobriand Islands, which are about 11 o'clock on the Kula Ring. And what Kula involved was the exchange of prestige valuables that you had. Kula was really the way that people achieved fame and transmitted their fame to other persons was through obtaining prestige valuables, these particular objects of extreme value, and having them for a while and then sending them to someone else, and it would take your name with it. So, and there were two kinds of kula valuable. One was called the sulava, which were these long necklaces of shell discs, and the other was called the mwali, which were these white arm shells. And you had two different type of kula partners. It was mainly important men who were involved in kula, that if you gave someone sulava, you didn't give them wali. That simply wasn't done. That you gave someone the kula valuable of the other kind. And what happened is you'd have, if you were in the Trobriand Islands, you'd have a partner which may be on the next island round, and every so much months that someone would come from those islands to you on the Trobriand Islands, a whole fleet of people from that other island, say Woodlark Island or Gawa or somewhere like that, and come asking, trying to see if what they could get out of you in terms of kula valuables that they felt that belonged, that you should give them as a form of reciprocal exchange. So they'd come round looking for sulava because you'd given them wali a few months before. So you had these expeditions, and so these valuables would go round the kula rang over a kind of long periods of time, being passed from partner to partner. And what Malinowski found is the sulava tended to go clockwise round, slowly round, and the wali went anti-clockwise, and people would often, on the same island, would often have the same partner for one particular valuable, so they'd be competing and trying to jolly each other up their partners, hoping to get that particularly valuable kula valuable they thought was coming round the ring. They thought, if it didn't go to them, it was a terrible scandal, witchcraft, all of that kind of thing. And what kula was really about, it was like a cross between art collecting, poker and chess. And the people enjoyed it because what the whole point of having a kula valuable was that your name would then be attached to these famous objects, which would then be passed on to someone else. The sulava to your partner clockwise, and the mwali to another partner counterclockwise, and your name to these famous kula valuables. And these valuables were famous, would be passed on. So this for Trobriand Islanders, this was the most important, or most perhaps not in terms of subsistence, but in terms of the symbolic importance, the most important aspect of their economy. And you also had Kula taking place alongside Gimwali. Gimwali was kind of like secular barter. So these Kula expeditions, which would go from one island to another, that they'd be accompanied by secular, just ordinary barter. But you didn't do Gimwali with your Kula partners. That was very bad form, you know, very vulgar. So you would do, and so on. So they were kept quite separate. So what was Kula for? Well, it was to, perhaps some people have said, or used a functionalist explanation to say it provided a sort of umbrella piece for the whole area so that people could obtain the goods from other islands and so on. But I suspect it was more simply about fame and prestige and about establishing you as being an important person and so forth. So, prestige valuables are distinct from money, as noted, that money performs as a means of exchange. It's a standard of value, a means of payment and a store of wealth. But arguably, perhaps Kula valuables and other kinds of Kula valuables like other kind of valuables like potlatch coppers and pigs in the New Guinea Highlands, don't they do the same thing? Aren't they, all of those perform all of those functions? A Kula valuable could be said to do all of those things. So, then perhaps in that sense that Kula valuables are in some sense like money. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Kula valuables can't buy everything. They can only buy one thing, and that's the other Kula valuable, or at least the prestige that's attached to it. But I want to hold that thought for a minute, because it's not quite as simple as that money isn't as all buying as you might think, and there's a kind of large grey area between many kinds of prestige valuable, like Kula valuables, and some kinds of money, which I'll come on to. So, Malinowski offered the evidence of the Kula as against the universality of the economic man, that human beings were essentially motivated by the market, that it was gift exchange that motivated economic behaviour, and this was a different kind of morality that was based on economies which were organised principally about barter. I know that they had barter in the form of Gimwali, but it was essentially Kula was really what was far more important. And since then, the gift exchange was the importance of it after Malinowski was being demonstrated in the ethnographic literature time and time again, and very shortly after the publication of Malinowski's book on this, which is called Argonauts of the Western Pacific, published in 1926, almost immediately, 1922, almost 3 or 4 years after, the Marcel Mauss published a book called The Gift, which is translated as The Gift, and what Mauss did was, using the material Malinowski stuff on Kula, some stuff on Roman law, and some materials on potlatch that other anthropologists had looked at, that he tried to develop a theory of gift exchange and how gift exchange was to work. And he saw it as a kind of form of primitive contract that was based essentially on 3 obligations. And this is a very important idea in social anthropology. And Mauss's idea were founded on 3 obligations. One was the obligation to give, and the obligation to give is founded on the idea that you need to establish relations with others, so you give to them and establish relations with them. The second is the obligation to receive, because if you don't, you're failing to meet the challenge, you perhaps can be perceived as a hostile act, and perhaps your loss of dignity and so on. And then, most importantly for most, the obligation to reciprocate, because you lose status if you do. So that gift giving has these 3 important, it's organised around these 3 obligations. And what thing about gifts, which is interesting in Mauss's work, is that he argues that gifts motivated their return, being return gifts, because they what they carried was, he borrowed this idea from a Maori term, the hau, which meant the spirit of the gift, that gifts embody the spirit of the donor, the social personality of the donor, and that that is what comes with the gift. That's why you don't, with that horrible knitted sweater that your aunt gave you last Christmas, that's why you don't throw it away, because it has your aunt's social personality there. And
don't look at me.
I wasn't looking at you. No, I wasn't looking at you. I actually really like your sweater. So anyway, That's the example I've used with the students. That wasn't no to you, John. And anyway, so this is what gift exchange is around, organised around these the notion of obligations and reciprocity, and the whole of social life and social anthropology. For many social anthropologists, that what really social life turns on is ideas of reciprocity, and there have been dozens and dozens, possibly hundreds of ethnographies which are centred on gift exchange in different societies, because this is a key organising principle. And expanding the notion of reciprocity, people like Salins, for example, have argued quite usefully that you can have this distinction between generalised reciprocity, where you give without any overt sense that it has to be reciprocated. So when you give gifts to members of your family, you say, oh, you didn't have to, you know, and you didn't have to buy me anything, you know, and oh, but I didn't buy you a present next year. Oh, never mind, you know, all this kind of stuff. Then you've got balanced reciprocity, which is where it's kind of you're calculating whether the equivalence of the two. And then there's negative reciprocity, which is either can be thought of as two ways. Either it's reciprocal raiding, stealing and that kind of thing, or it can be forms of gift that are hostile in motivation. I was angry with him, so I gave him a pig, and so on. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that So many scholars argue that gifts and commodities being gifts, objects that are things that are transmitted through barter, circulate according to quite different logics. So commodities are alienable gifts transacted by aliens. In other words, they can be detached from you, and given to someone who's not part of you. Whereas gifts are the inalien objects transacted by non-aliens. In other words, these are gifts that carry part of your social personality, and when you receive them, that you are socially entangled with them. Hence, Nick Thomasborough has written a book about this, on the theory of this in the gifts in the Pacific, called Entangled Objects, which is about exactly all of this. So what do commodities create relations between things? Some anthropologists argue that you exchange the pig for the cow and so forth, but gifts use things to create relations between persons. So that's an essential difference. In commodity-based economies, barter-type economies, for example, and purchase economies, persons become thing-like. In gift-organised economies, things acquire social personalities. This is one of the received wisdoms in economic anthropology, and the real champion of that distinction is Chris Gregory, and he argues that the exchange of commodities is by transactors in a state of reciprocal independence. They don't have anything really to do with each other beyond the exchange, but that's not the case for those who are involved in gift exchange, rather. So summarising, Gregory usefully collates the distinctions. He says that with commodity exchange, that you try to maximise your income, accumulate profit, exchange unlike for unlike, and you measure the relative value of goods. In gift exchange, you're not really interested in all of those things at all. You're interested in maximising your outgoings, giving as much as you can, to acquire a large obligated following, ideally. You're exchanging like for like, and what you're interested in is not measuring the relative value of goods, but measuring the relative status or rank of those with whom you transact, who may be ranked somehow become less worthy than you are because they can't pay you back that gift. So this is the other kind of narrative in anthropology, that money comes out of gift exchange. So what I want to do, though, is kind of think about how we might kind of reconcile those two kind of approaches. That first of all, the first thing is that we have to consider that not all monies are alike, that monies are very different from one another. They're quite different animals to one another. And then what we need to do is, I think, or not need to do, but what is quite useful, is to look at anthropology's set of conceptual tools. Anthropology has developed a kind of, I think, quite a useful set of conceptual tools for looking at how money and prestige goods work in circulation, and how they are similar but in some sense distinct at the same time, and how they work. Well, one of the key ideas comes from the 1950s, from an anthropologist called Paul Bohannon, who worked in Nigeria with a people called the Tiv. And what Bohannon was interested in was in this intuitive difference that money can buy everything while goods used as gifts cannot. Yeah, so money is a money that can buy all anything, whereas prestige goods can't really do that. They can only, like cooler valuables, can only be exchanged for other kinds of goods. But one thing about money, that all exchange technologies, even cash, can't really buy everything. There are certain things that either by law or convention that money isn't supposed to be able to buy, like sex and other kind of things that money it does, but people say that it's not supposed to, that there's moralities, that there are moralities concerned with what money does, that exchange technologies, that they have all currencies have their limitations in what they can do. And what Bohannon did was he demonstrated this very nicely for the TIV, and he argued that traditionally in the past, up to about 60 or so years before he did fieldwork, he was looking at historical records, talking to older TIV, that the TIV economy was organised around three what he calls spheres of exchange. This notion of spheres of exchange is a very useful idea in anthropology. One at the bottom was the subsistence sphere of exchange. So you've got things like foodstuffs, chickens, goats, household utensils. All of those things could be exchanged with one another for one another without any problem. Then you've got a prestige sphere, which involved slaves, cattle, brass rods, white cloth. And within that sphere of exchange, brass rods were the currency that were used for that to buy and sell things within that prestige sphere of exchange, or used as gift giving, perhaps more properly. And then the highest form of exchange was women and dependent persons, and that women and dependent persons were exchanged through a kind of form of classificatory sister exchange, whereby if Group A and Group B, Group A would give one of their women to Group B in the marriage, and then Group B would have at some point to give one of their women back to Group A as a reciprocal exchange, and they'd be then linked to finally, or as in-laws, and that was a different sphere of exchange. But none of these other things could, ideally at least, interfere with one another. Now, exchanges within a particular sphere of exchange, like bolts of cloth for brass rods, were called conveyances. And Bohannon noted that these were generally morally neutral, that if you buy a kitchen utensil for a yam or something, it's no big deal, that they're in the same sphere of exchange. But what you have is sometimes you have people who will manage to sell their chickens for a brass rod. In other words, they're selling between spheres of exchange, and this is rather morally charged. This is something which people would say that the person who sold the chickens would be, guilty of sharp practice. This is something which is rather, not very good. Whereas the person who's exchanged for the brass rods would be somehow rather gullible. So what you have is these three spheres of exchange are insulated from one another by moral conventions, and someone like Igor Kopytov, who's an important anthropologist in the States, regards this idea as so important that he regards the insulation between spheres of exchange as constituting the very basis of culture in his view. So this is really a kind of important idea. So you have these three spheres of exchange in the traditional TIV economy, as Bohannon models it. Then what happens, around about 1900, the British colonial authorities start taxing the TIV, and for that they need to get money. They get money, then they realise money can buy everything in all the spheres of exchange, and these three spheres of exchange become collapsed into one singular sphere of exchange, and money starts to be able to buy everything, and the moral distinctions that kept those three spheres of exchange insulated and separate from one another dissolve under the onslaught of money, which is appearing from 1900 onwards. So what you have is you have this special purpose money, which is TIV brass rods, for example, which in some ways like a prestige valuable, a bit like cooler valuables, except they can maybe be exchanged for a few more things, but there's still by no means a general purpose money. This is very much still TIV brass rods are a special purpose money, not a special purpose of cooler valuables, but nevertheless a special purpose money. Is now you've got it being attacked by this general purpose money, pound sterling. So the multicentric economy, where you have these three spheres of exchange, now becomes a unicentric sphere of exchange, which determines the cash. And now that you had cattle and women who had existed in different spheres of exchange become, because it's dissolved and you have the appearance of bride wealth, whereas before it was simply sister exchange, woman for woman. Now you have cattle for women and you have the appearance for amongst the tiv of bride wealth, where hitherto it hadn't existed, according to Bohannon. Well, there's been some criticisms of Bohannon's. Bohannon's ideas have been remarkably productive, and the whole notion of spheres of exchange has been really, really useful in getting us to see how prestige valuables work and how their power is in some sense circumscribed and so on. But at the same time, it's Bohannon's idea, or very powerful, and the notion of conveyances and conversions also very important, and the relationship between money. And it inspired a book which was edited by Parry and Block, who were actually rather critical of Bohannon's ideas, but these were considered important enough to inspire their book Money and the Morality of Exchange. And Parry and Block argues that and the contributors in a collection of chapters by different authors argued that money is not necessarily the devilish corrosive social acid that they say it is, that in many cases that money is absorbed into pre-existing spheres of exchange, and that money, when it enters other previously non-monetarized economies, sometimes can start being transacted as a prestige good, which is something which is rather interesting, or converted into other ways. So examples are Janet Carson's book about how money is cooked into being and used in some other way among Malays in Langkawi, and how money is used for drinking, and that drinking reproduces something socially reproductive in Fiji, according to Christina Torren. So you've got this that money, and if you've ever seen the film, some of you may have seen the film Onka's Big Mocha, which is very famous about the exchange of pigs, and these are about New Guinea big men who acquire through small exchanges, which are called mocha. They get together all these pigs and they give them to another big man of a rival group, who then has to reciprocate or forever be shamed. And it's about this. The film is about this fellow Onka who's trying to get together a big pig exchange because someone gave one to him in the distant past, and he's trying to now reciprocate. And part of when he lays out the big mocha, the thing with it's all these pigs. There's also quite a lot of money that's in there. Something like 1,500 Australian dollars are included in this gift. So there we see money being used not as a commodity or in barter, or to facilitate barter, but it's actually being used as a gift. So money can be used as a gift, although its properties, the fact that all money tends to look alike, that it makes it not a very good gift, that doesn't necessarily rule it out as being so. So Parry and Block provide these criticisms of Bohannon. They also provide some criticisms of his history of the TIV, but that's another question. Another idea that's really important for thinking about these questions about money, which is really developed by Keith Hart and Mary Douglas in particular in their different ways, but it's this idea, the notion that what Keith Hart calls the heads and tails characteristics of money. This is a way of thinking about how different kinds of money have different kinds of properties, and what circumscribes their uses and how they're imagined to be, their myths of origin about them, their value, and so on. And this is the idea that all money, that coins tend to have, the idea that money have heads and tails characteristic comes from the idea that coins tend to have one side is heads and the other side is tails. And the tails represents the actual denominational value, like if you've got a penny and then a 2p bit, that one is worth double the more. So it's really what it represents. The tails aspects of money is the way the market determines the value of a particular money is the heads characteristics. So it's the market's influence on the meaning of that particular money is the heads. the tails aspect of it. The heads aspect of it is the way that society determines the meanings of that money. So things like go into the meaning of those pound coins. And remember, if we take the view that the value of money is determined partly by all of its transactions that take place within the economy in which it's used, the pound coin is determined partly by the fact that of all the pound transactions that are going on in the world, but it's also determined in part by the freedoms that it has within the market, which are its tails aspect of the pound, and the heads aspect are the things that the limitations and constraints and whatever that the state pays on it. So it's all the things like taxes, parking tickets, all of those kind of things, your council tax, all of those things are the tails aspects of the money. And
you mean the heads aspect?
The heads aspect. Thank you very much. Very well done for paying attention.
I'm lost on the heads and tails.
The tails aspect is those areas of a particular currency, those aspects of it which are determined by the market and exchange, and the heads are determined by society. So different monies have different values on that. And if we go back to the caritas that we had in communist Romania, that clearly the heads aspect of the money, the value of Romanian money was very much more important. Whereas afterwards, after the fall of communist regime in Romania, money is reinvented and the tails aspect becomes very much more important.
You're talking about the state versus the market, aren't you, really?
Yeah, I'm not talking about it in terms of a conflict, but in terms of different influences on the value of it. Yeah. So you've got these two different aspects, these two different forces which impact on what the money is and how it might work. Mary Douglas makes a very similar distinction. She talks about real money, which real money is, its value is determined principally by the market, and then what she calls coupon money, where the prices of the money is really determined by the state or society in some sense. So coupon money is things like communist era money, that the value of the price of the car, for example, in Bulgaria in, I don't know, 1950s might have been determined by the state, not by the market, and things like that. So in that sense, that money in Bulgaria in the 1950s worked more like coupons in Douglas's distinction than they did as real money being determined by the value. And the same distinction has been made between domesticated money, which is Chris Gregory's distinction, which is money that's primarily the value is determined by state interventions, if you like, and then savage money, which is determined by the market, sort of thing. And here's a little distinction between these two types of money. You've got some primarily tails type monies there on the left, which is New Guinea Highland shell monies, and what's interesting about those is that they rapidly disappeared when the Australian traders arrived in Papua New Guinea. They realised these in the highlands where shells were quite scarce and were being trickled up to the coast. They just said, oh, let's fill up a truck with these, and they went up into the highlands with a whole truckload, and all of a sudden the money collapsed and said, okay, forget that, we're to do pigs instead. So pigs became the new currency, and mocha and so forth. And all of these other, of course, you've got Western hard currencies, and then you've got some other monies with values that are determined by society, like Tiv brass rods, for example, Soviet era soft currencies, rationing coupons in the Second World War in Britain, Let's currencies. I'm sure some of you are familiar with local trading system monies, that some places in parts of Britain that people set up their own currencies, like call it things like the acorn. There's the yeah, and there's the Brixton pound, which Amajit's an expert on, and there's Tiv brass rods, and also Rossel Island money. And Rossel Island money is in some ways one of the most fascinating of all of these. And Rossel Island was down here somewhere, and it was an island that was outside of the Messim. It was outside of the Kula Ring, and it was economically and socially isolated from its neighbours. People said Rossel Islanders are all cannibals, that no one really wanted to go there. It was quite a sort of isolated place. But what was really interesting about Rossel Island was that they had lots of different monies. They had monies that were really shells, these high value or some low value shells, and they had two different types of money called Nko and Ndap, and I'm only going to even talk about Ndap, and there were 22 different kinds of money for Ndap, 22 different, these are not different value currencies, these are different different monies, each one, what happens with Ndap is with Ndap monies that it's not necessarily easy to use one kind of Ndap money to buy something which is for something of which another kind of Ndap money should be. And anthropologists numbered these through 1 to 22, with 22 being supposedly the most highest value and 1 the most prosaic, mundane. Conversions, in other words, exchanging, as to use Bohannon's term, between classes 1 to 10 was relatively easy, and also between 11 and 17, or no, not between those two sets, but the higher numbers, 18 to 22, that each one of 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, each one was insulated from the others, and it wasn't easily exchanged. It would have been a very morally charged conversion if you use something from one of those.
The indemnity payment.
If you kill someone, if your family kills someone, you pay someone.
Cannibalism comes in.
No, that was just below other people's perception of it. But they had blood wealth payments were really, if your family kills someone, you have to pay them compensation. So anyway, so you had these, and I think it was with the bride wealth payments, which is number 17. The currency, these shells, had to be approached with reverence crouching. This is the kind of money that you couldn't actually just go and pick it up and spend it. You had to. And the other one, the blood indemnity payments, the currencies, the shells for number 20, were not allowed to see the light of day. These are blood wealth payments. They were kept inside, locked away inside. So you've got all of these different monies with different working in different and loads of different spheres of exchange. And what's another thing that's interesting is that there was perceived to be a finite number of shells, and that what Rossel Islanders said was that God made all the money before humans came to Rossel Island. So money pre-existed human beings in this idea. Another thing that's really interesting about Rossel Island money, there was never enough in circulation at any one time. So in fact, conversions, these morally dubious things, were actually going on all the time, and you had this class of usurers, if you like, who would exchange them. They were sort of like currency exchange people who would exchange between these different. It was a bit like sort of going to one of those currency exchange things in Leicester Square where you know you're going to get ripped off, and but you still have to go because there were never enough shells in circulation for the to meet all the social commitments that were necessary. So what's interesting is, so Rossel Island, according to Lorraine Barrett, who's studied it, said was a frenzy of financial activity in a self-supporting circular system of socio-economic relationships. I think it's really very interesting. So Rossel Island presents an interesting case of the areas where prestige valuables, which are and items more kind of which are like barter items, which are the share and that monies at the lower end of the things, really exist on a kind of continuum. There's not really any absolute distinction between objects which are used as technology barter exchange and those which are used as gift exchange. In an interesting book edited by Arjun Appadurai, that Appadurai and another author, Kopitov, who I referred to earlier, that they examined this idea that one of the things that's really interesting about objects, though, is that many objects move in and out of the categories of being either exchange or a commodity. Example is I'm wearing one here. This is a Nicaraguan 1 Cordoba piece, which at one time was actually clearly a commodity in the Marxist sense, and it can be used to buy bit of chewing gum or something like that, not very much, but now it has no value at all because it's no longer a state currency, and I have very sentimental attachment to it because it's given to me by a dear friend who's dead now. So things now this thing has moved out of one kind of category and into the other. So Bohannon and Kopitov look at this, well, Appadurai talks about looking at the social life of things, and Kopitov at the cultural biography of things, like how, for example, a house may become more and more run down, an old leaf house, and then it's given to sort of a widowed grandmother, and then from there it becomes a playhouse for the children or a chicken coop, and so the house undergoes these different changes in its biography. And one of the things that Kopitov talks about, which I think is a really interesting idea, is this tension between singularization and commodification of things, that all things as they exist in culture, that things have a tendency either to become more singular and therefore have the more propensity to be used, or the possibility to be used in gift exchanges, more singular, more unique, or more commodified. In other words, they become to be imagined as just one within a category of other things. Yeah, and Kopitov looks at this kind of idea. In terms of thinking about how monies change, that we might look at how beyond things like paper and metal money, and look at other kinds of technologies of exchange, like credit cards, like internet transactions, things like commodity futures, big bellies, blah blah, all those kind of things. We also might consider money and historically its relationship to gold, which was of course once arguably a prestige valuable. So in what sense, what's the history of money's relationship to goals? Again, looking at competing ideas about how economy should be run, of Keynes versus Friedman and so forth. We can look at things like histories of money, for example, things and what's happened, notable events such as the Bretton Woods Agreement, and also when Nixon delinked the dollar from just about everything else, and it became savage, yeah. And so on that note, I'm going to leave you just a few points to consider. That firstly, that monies vary very much in their characters. Monies and prestige valuables are often, I think, remarkably similar in the way they circulate, and when we come to look at things like so-called primitive monies, that we can see that the distinction between money and prestige valuables in terms of how they work and operate and everything is not at all clear-cut by any means, as a look at the Rossel Island and the Tiv ethnography might show. So we're looking, money works in very, very different ways, and then we're thinking about money and gifts. Are these really contrastive opposites or not? So on that note, I'll call it a day, and thank you very much for your attention.